While millions of people are screaming at their TVs, painting their faces, and getting emotionally destroyed because 11 strangers lost a game, there's a massive, quietly growing group of people who just don't care. They sit through Super Bowl parties genuinely confused about what's happening. They nod politely when colleagues talk about last night's match. They've Googled how to pretend you like sports at least once in their lives, and the world treats them like something is fundamentally broken. You don't watch football? But it's the World Cup. You don't follow basketball? But it's the finals. As if caring about athletic competition is not a preference, but a basic requirement of personhood, a tax you owe for being human. The sports indifferent person learns early to navigate this. They learn to fake it just enough, to nod at the right moment, to say, yeah, tough loss, without knowing what was lost, to exist inside a culture that treats their indifference as a personality defect. So today we're going to ask a question almost nobody takes seriously. What is actually going on psychologically with people who feel nothing toward sports? Are they wired differently? Are they missing something real? Or are they, in some ways, seeing something the rest of us can't? The answer is far more interesting than you expect. The first thing to understand is that not caring about sports is not the same as not caring about anything. Most people in this group are deeply passionate about music, film, science, cooking, travel, literature, art, technology. They feel things intensely. They just don't feel it about this particular domain. And there's a clear neurological reason for that. When we engage with something repeatedly during childhood and adolescence, when we learn the rules, develop emotional associations, build memories around it, the brain constructs what neuroscientists call a reward pathway, a dedicated circuit that fires when that stimulus appears. Sports fans didn't simply decide to love football. They were conditioned to love it. The excitement of watching with a parent, the ritual of match days, the tension in the final minutes, all of it became neurologically encoded. The brain learned this matters. Feel something. People who weren't immersed in sports culture early in life simply never built that pathway. The neural architecture for caring isn't there, not because something went wrong, but because it was never constructed in the first place. Think of it like language. A child raised in a bilingual household effortlessly absorbs two languages. A child who hears only one language struggles to pick up a second later in life, not because of inferior intelligence, but because the critical developmental window passed. Sports works similarly. The emotional language of fandom is easiest to learn when you're young, when the brain is plastic, when rituals feel magical rather than arbitrary. For people who didn't receive that early exposure, whether because their families weren't interested, their culture didn't prioritize it, or they were simply drawn elsewhere, sports remains a language they were never taught, and no amount of adult effort fully replicates what early immersion creates. Here's where it gets psychologically deeper. Because for most fans, sports isn't really about sports at all. It's about identity, belonging, and what evolutionary psychologists call tribal affiliation. Supporting a team answers the ancient question, who are my people, with almost no effort. You pick a team, usually the one your father loved, or the city you grew up in, and suddenly you belong somewhere. You have a tribe, shared rituals, shared enemies, and a reason to connect with a complete stranger in seconds. People who don't follow sports often struggle to access this channel. In cultures where sports is the dominant social currency, where most small talk and office bonding orbit around last night's game, not participating can feel quietly isolating. Not aggressively excluded, but adrift. But here's the counterintuitive insight. People who don't rely on sports for identity are forced to build their sense of self through more deliberate means, through chosen values, intellectual passions, and intentional communities. Research suggests this kind of self-constructed identity tends to be more stable under pressure, less likely to collapse when something outside your control goes wrong. The most consistently reported experience among sports indifferent people isn't boredom, it's exhaustion. The exhaustion of performing interest they genuinely don't feel. Psychologists call this emotional labor, managing your visible reactions to meet social expectations, at the watch party, reacting at the right moments, in the office asking questions that sound engaged, with family, pretending the result actually matters, over and over again. Research on emotional masking consistently shows that suppressing authentic reactions increases feelings of loneliness, even in a crowd. You are surrounded by people. You are not connected to them. The version of you that showed up isn't really you. What most sports indifferent people actually crave is depth, one-on-one connection, shared ideas, not shared scores. They're not antisocial. They're calibrated for a different frequency of human contact. People who don't follow sports watch fan culture from the outside with a mixture of curiosity and bafflement. And that outsider position grants a clarity that people inside the system can't easily access. They notice how heavily fandom is constructed and marketed, how the emotional investment of hundreds of millions of people is monetized into broadcasting rights, merchandise, and gambling platforms, how tribal loyalty is engineered, maintained by league structures that make city-based rivalries feel ancient when they're often the result of decisions made in boardrooms. Psychologists note that people outside a tribe can identify its mechanisms more clearly than those within it, not because they're smarter, but because they're not invested in protecting the narrative. The fan experiences the rivalry as sacred. The non-fan sees how that feeling was built. Both perspectives are real. They're just seeing from different sides of the glass. Research shows a few consistent traits among sports indifferent people. They score higher on need for cognition, a preference for complex, abstract thinking over ritualized, outcome-driven spectacle. They score higher on openness to experience, intellectual curiosity, aesthetic sensitivity, comfort with ambiguity, and they show lower in-group conformity, less driven by tribal belonging, more oriented toward individual depth and chosen relationships. This doesn't make them better or worse. It makes them a distinct psychological profile that happens to be poorly served by the dominant leisure culture of most societies. They're not broken. They're just tuned differently. Every sports indifferent person eventually faces the conversion attempt. Someone who loves sports decides the indifference is a problem they can solve. They find the perfect game. They insist you just need to see it live, feel the crowd, and then you'll get it. They take your not caring almost personally, as if it quietly judges their caring. Sometimes it works, usually it doesn't, and both people walk away with a small residue of awkward failure. The confusion here is between preference and deficiency. You cannot manually install a decade of childhood memories and emotional conditioning. That architecture takes years to build. It cannot be replicated in one afternoon. The most honest thing both sides can do is accept that some emotional frequencies are simply not universal and stop treating that as something to fix. People who don't care about sports are not emotionally stunted or failing at being human. They didn't receive early conditioning around it. Their personality orients toward depth over spectacle, and they've quietly built belonging through other means. Sports fandom at its best is beautiful. Thousands of strangers feeling exactly the same thing at the same moment. That's real, but it is not the only way to connect, and it is not a requirement. The person sitting quietly at the back of the party, watching the room more than the screen, they're not missing the point. They're paying attention to a different one. If this made you feel seen, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more.